Harvard University is launching an anti-Semitism advisory board amid building tensions over the Israel-Hamas war, seen in this video posted to social media. And it's not just Harvard. Classes at Cornell University were canceled for a day over anti-Semitic threats and extraordinary stress over the war. At Tulane University, 2 Jewish students were reportedly assaulted by pro-Palestinian protesters. And in New York City, the governor announced an independent review of anti-Semitism policies at public colleges in the city. In just the first 2 weeks after the Hamas attack on Israel, the Anti-Defamation League recorded 312 anti-Semitic incidents. That's nearly 4 times higher than the same time last year. So what can colleges do to ramp down tensions, protect students, and protect academic freedom? I'm joined now by Cornell Brooks, former president of the NAACP, who now teaches public leadership and social justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, and by Jeremy Burton, executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. Jeremy, Cornell, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Jeremy, what are you seeing on campuses across the country?
Well, as you indicated in your intro, there are some truly horrific and scary incidents going on many campuses around the country. Candidly, while some of the most prominent Ivy League and most prominent schools in the country have gotten the attention, this is happening everywhere. And even here in Boston, the attention has been given to Harvard University, but I'm hearing about incidents at Wellesley, at Simmons, at Emerson, at BU, et cetera, that are just very scary.
So, Cornell, you've spent your life fighting racism and bigotry of all kinds. It must be shocking to see a resurgence of the oldest form of bigotry coming, I won't say out of nowhere, but in a way that we would not have expected even a few years ago.
It is morally shocking, but historically unsurprising. Because just as you named, anti-Semitism as the oldest hate predates this war and will likely continue after this war. And what we see on American college campuses is emblematic of what has happened and is happening all across this country. And if the statistics are true, and we have every reason to believe that they are, is happening around the world. So this is a serious moment. It's not historically shocking, but it should make us vigilant and decisive in terms of how we respond to it.
So, Jeremy, do you have an explanation for what we're seeing here?
Well, I think that in times of trauma, in times of division, there is a propensity to go to classic hatreds and, frankly, classic explanations of who is my oppressor, who is behind whatever harm I am experiencing. And I think we've seen that in this country in recent years, that for a variety of reasons, people from the left, from the right, in seeking someone to blame for their troubles, go back to that default of, it must be the Jews. There are other forms of hatred and bigotry that are on the rise, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and they each have a particular character to them. But anti-Semitism is deeply rooted in the idea that fundamentally the Jew is to blame for whatever is going wrong in my society. And it is no surprise at a time like this, when people are angry and feeling pain, they're turning to the Jew to blame.
So historically, anti-Semitism is, obviously a part of American society, a part of European society all around the world, but I think it's been more associated with the right than the left. And so I think a lot of the shock that we're seeing here is in places that sort of very self-consciously identify themselves as being safe and welcoming of minorities and having large institutional establishments for diversity and seeing incidents that are, clearly not protesting policies, but have clearly crossed some sort of a line into, open anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. So I think that there is a false sense of security derived from ideology or party, which is to say that anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, xenophobia is associated with the right. And in terms of violence, it most certainly is, but it is not the monopoly of the right. And so we need not be vigilant with respect to one side of the ideological spectrum and then to ignore the prospect of hate and violence and hate crimes on the other side. It's a matter of attacking hate for what it is as such. And so when we see this spike in anti-Semitism 400% most recently, much more than that over the last 6 or so years, it should be alarming for us because it literally represents a threat to our democracy and a threat to our democracy in the place where we are most vulnerable, namely among our young people, and in the places where we should expect at least, that is to say, on college campuses where we nurture the intellect, we build character, we literally prepare those who are going to be the custodians of our democracy. So the point being here is we can't derive any false sense of security because the anti-Semite, the racist, has a D or an R or conservative or liberal attached to their ideology and their hate.
I agree with what Cornell said, and I would add that it actually isn't surprising to see this kind of anti-Semitism appearing on the far left. I think one of the dangers we have as a society is saying that anti-Semitism fits neatly onto an ideological wing of the political spectrum, and that in some part, we've had a very toxic dynamic where people weaponize anti-Semitism to go after their political opponents, so we don't get attention to anti-Semitism as it shows up in a variety of ways. We've certainly seen anti-Semitism on the left rising. I think right here in Boston, we saw that last year around the mapping project and the desire by some to say that the local Jewish community in Boston ought to be dismantled for its role in everything from American colonialism to the existence of, every problem under the sun. What is more troubling right now in the last 4 weeks is that it's essentially coming out of the closet, that people are marching in the streets declaring explicit support for a terrorist organization, celebrating terrorism. And I think what's also challenging is that good people in liberal society are finding it difficult to find the words to denounce it and to stand up to it.
Jeremy, I just have to say, thank you for naming this as such. What I mean by that is rape, murder, torture, beheadings are, at their essence, violence. And where you target Jewish people for such, this is emblematic of anti-Semitism. It is what it is. And we can't apologize for it. We can't create predicate conditions for calling out anti-Semitism. We have to call it for what it is, wherever it appears, and whoever is the perpetrator. It is what it is. Because if we don't do such, we literally morally enfeeble ourselves. We literally disempower ourselves as human beings and as moral beings. And I would note here and argue here, we also make ourselves less able to call out other isms. Note this, there are only two organizations in this country that were created to address hate crimes and in response to lynchings, the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League. Both such organizations have condemned other forms of hate. So unless we call out this root hate, we're going to be less able to call out Islamophobia, less able to call out anti-Black racism, less able to call out anti-Asian racism or Islamophobia or any of the other isms that plague our democracy. So we have to start at the root.
Yeah. So this isn't just a Boston phenomenon. What we see is across the country, there's a map from the ADL showing anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Israel rallies that occurred just in October. Mm-hmm. And we want to differentiate here. You can oppose the policies of the Israeli government without going over anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
But somehow the groups and rallies that are sort of most enthusiastic about saying we should not blame all Palestinians for the actions of Hamas, which clearly we should not, sometimes seem to have difficulty distinguishing between the actions of Israel and all Jews. And I wonder if it's worth commenting on that.
I'm glad you pointed that out, and I would connect that to what Cornell was just saying as well, that I think it's incumbent on all of us to recognize that we have to speak out against all the isms, the hatreds right now. FBI Director Wray just yesterday spoke to the skyrocketing anti-Semitism and anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia in this country. I feel it's incumbent on me as a Jewish leader to call out those members of Congress who, frankly, went on the floor yesterday and said that all Palestinians are Hamas and all Palestinians are Nazis. That has to be called out. We also need other leaders to be calling out the anti-Semitism. There's no question one can be deeply critical of the government of a country without being anti-Semitic, just as one can be deeply critical of the American government without being anti-American. And the challenge is that people are, all across the country, making this leap into the dehumanization of Jews. And I'll just give one example that we're seeing all across the country and frankly across the world, people who are proudly going on camera almost like it's a Tide Pod challenge and tearing down the signs of these 220-odd people, including babies, who are being held hostage. And somehow there is this need in this moment, not just to say we're critical of the Israeli response in Gaza or we are critical of the occupation, but that we need to dehumanize the Jew in this moment in order to move forward with our neat ideological package.
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, that's really frightening. Why? So to the extent that we have people ripping down pictures of kidnapped victims, including children, rendering Jewish people at a moment of trauma and bigotry and violence invisible. This is on a moral plane with other ways in which we make other people invisible. So in other words, you can't like literally obliterate someone's humanity, obliterate their moral visibility, and call it anything other than what it is, which is a form of hate. I think it's important to look at the victims of kidnapping. I think it's important for us to look at the victims of bombings in Palestine in terms of kids and refugee camps. We can't wrap people in a veil of invisibility because in doing so, we make our own humanity less visible. So that is just unconscionable. We don't need to be ripping down posters. We need to be lifting people up and we need to be educating people. Because note in this moment that the shocking ignorance with respect to the Holocaust, the fact that if you ask many people and even a few students, what is a pogrom? Sometimes you get a blank stare, as in not knowing, being ignorant, and historically and morally oblivious. It's a real need for education.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned the use of anti-Semitism as a political weapon, and I think we're seeing that as well, where President Trump, who dined with a neo-Nazi, and sort of members of Congress who talk about Jewish space lasers starting forest fires, seem to be now standing out and accusing the other side of fostering anti-Semitism. How do we guard against this being used as a political football instead of being used as something that we actually need to all be aligned in fighting against?
I would say it very simply. If you only are calling out anti-Semitism when it serves your partisan interest to do that, you're not being a friend to the Jewish community. And if you're only calling out anti-Semitism when it's on the other side of the political aisle, you're not actually serious about it fighting anti-Semitism. You're interested in making political points. I would love to see the Republican caucus in Congress or the Republican Party deal with the anti-Semitism within its ideological partners and within its own caucus. And I would love to see the Democratic Party, and I'm not going to get into naming names, to deal with anti-Semitism as it shows up in its coalitions and spaces. The two parties can take care of themselves. They need to stop worrying about the other one.
Yeah, may I note this? When Nazis were marching through the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, there were some of these people then when they were saying the Jews will not replace us. They, meaning black folks, will not replace us, with their tiki torches and their penchant for violence. Where were some of these folks then? And so, in other words, this partisanization, this political hijacking of the moral condemnation of anti-Semitism is duplicitous, disingenuous, and it too should be called out. And may I just make one other point, which Jeremy lifted up, which is to say, the Jewish community is not a monolith in the same way that black community is not a monolith. And so when I hear Jewish students very thoughtfully, and engaging in a kind of political and moral analysis of Israel's policies with respect to Palestinians, in the same way we see it among Muslim students and Palestinian students. So the point being is we need to give credit to young people for not being a monolith, for Jewish people, obviously, for not being a monolith, and stop this scapegoating by stereotyping and these overgeneralizations that literally play into these old, tired, vicious, and potentially violent tropes.
Cornell William Brooks, Jeremy Burton, thank you so much for being with us today.